Hello, Esther, and welcome back to the show. I'm really excited to share the news of your recent publication with the listeners and catch up with you about your life and your work. Would you like to start by reintroducing yourself to the listeners?
Sure. Casey, thank you for having me again. It's always fun to talk to you. My name is Esther Friedman. I am a therapist who works in the cult recovery world, or cultiverse, as we like to call it. I am just releasing a book called The Gentle Souls Revolution. I ended up here because, of course, I had my own misadventure in a cult, as we like to call it. And I think that's enough for now.
I love the term misadventure. People that listen regularly will have either heard you use it in our first talk
Mhm.
or will have heard me say across various episodes, oh, Esther Friedman, who I spoke to one time, uses the phrase misadventure. I just absolutely love it. I feel like it really takes away any blame that a person might put on themselves, and that's really important with the work that we're doing, of course, and adds an element of kind of casualness, and I don't think that there's much of that in this realm. Of course, the
Yeah.
subject matter is very heavy. Your experiences are particularly in some parts pretty heavy. So misadventure is kind of like allowing people to come in to this circle and hear this story, and so I use that all the time. So this is Esther Friedman, everybody. She's here to talk to us about her misadventure with the Odyssey study group. So we have discussed this before. I've spoken to you, I've spoken to Spencer Schneider, author of Manhattan Cult Story and good friend of the podcast, who
Mhm.
calls you Queen Esther. And if you're listening, hello, Spencer. We love
Hello,
you.
Spencer. Or Sir Spence, as I like to call him.
Sir Spencer, Queen Esther. I love it. The
He's a
queens of
nice,
the queens of the revolution.
yes.
Can you give us a brief summary of the history of the Odyssey study group?
Sure. Before I forget, to Casey, I love that we talk about this word misadventure because I do use it intentionally to lighten the load, to strip away the blame. And it is kind of funny. So, um, so the history. I just wanted to remember to say that before I got into the history. So, as I understand it, the Odyssey Study Group began in the late '60s, early '70s. Northern California, San Francisco area, groovy hippie, everyone getting stone time, right? By a man named Alex Horn who fancied himself a playwright. Um, Critics disagreed with him, but he fancied himself a playwright. And it went through several iterations. For a while, it was on a ranch, and then it became the Theater of All Possibilities. And I think there was a different theater in between. I can't quite remember. Um, they used to aggressively sell tickets to, I guess, what were like just terrible plays. The people who were members of this so-called theater group, they had to sell a certain amount of tickets, and they would go out and aggressively try to sell to people on the streets. And in the meantime, they were coupling up, they were having kids, and the kids were being neglected. Essentially, the San Francisco press started to investigate this weird group. There's a bunch of articles from the '70s in the San Francisco Chronicle and the Examiner. At this point, Alex Horn was married to Sharon Gans Horn. They shut the theater down. They migrated across the country, landed in New York City, and I guess Boston, which is where I am, and sprouted up, in a different format. So by the time I stumbled upon it, it was 2006. So I hope that gives you enough.
Definitely does. And I have to tell you about this wild experience that I had regarding this story. And you may have heard of this at this point. in conversations that you're having outside of our conversations and emails and stuff. But when I first came across this story of this group and of Sharon Gans and of the horrific treatment that she put onto others and then others put onto others and so on, it was really through my communication with Spencer initially
Hmm.
and the nature of the group, an esoteric hidden group. Before you came forward and began sharing your stories in blog posts, in news articles, in memoirs, no one really had any idea of this group, really. And like Spencer says in the opening of his book, we were hidden, we had to be. If somebody was to ask, well, where does this group take place? Well, we couldn't tell you because it's, different buildings, different times. So I was really intrigued by Spencer's story and experiences of New York.
Hmm.
And then he introduced me to you, and we began talking. And your experiences were kind of the follow on to New York City.
Yeah.
So when Sharon Gans and Alex Horn landed in New York City and opened up their Odyssey study group, a few years later branched out into Boston and you became involved. And I didn't really know much about the beginnings of the Odyssey study group other than what you and Spencer were able to tell me. So I was in this interview, which will have released by this point, and I was speaking to an author named Molly Salons, who's written a fictional book about her experiences in a cult. She's taken influences from her experiences and put them in a fictionalized piece. And it felt really familiar when I was reading the book, parts of it. And I couldn't really put my finger on why. And in our interview, Molly said something to me about certain people that I have been able to connect between yours and Spencer's stories. Same personality type, same type of language, same type of characteristics. And
Hmm.
then she mentioned something about New York City, and all of a sudden, I had this wild moment where I was like, Molly, can I just ask you, when you talk about this person, are you talking about Alex Horn? And she was just like, I can't tell you if you're correct, Casey. And it was like all of a sudden these pieces all click together. It was the most incredible thing because it made so much sense. And all of a sudden there was the first piece of this puzzle,
Yes.
the beginnings of the Odyssey study group and what it was like for individuals being recruited and indoctrinated in that part of the country. Then Spencer's story in New York and your story in Boston, and all of a sudden we've got this full circle picture. So I know that Molly's mentioned that you've been in touch with one another since
Think
since
about,
she has, yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
how's that for you, hearing all about that part of this wider picture?
Um, well, at this point, it is simply fascinating to me to find out what the history was and also what it morphed into, by the time the new millennium came along and I meet my new friend, quote unquote, Lisa, I mean, the California 1960s, 70s version was, at least in Boston, they think, again, I think this was different in New York, but so much more insidious and less violent, less physically violent. I think the psychological violence, it takes longer, but I think the result is the same, right? But I didn't see physical violence or sexual violence in my experience. So it's just one really fascinating for me to talk to her because I was asking her, was it really? I mean, her book, which I've read and is quite good, by the way. Um, it takes it to a higher, it ups the drama, right? but it was still pretty representative of what was going on, right? And for me, the theme, Casey, is I didn't know what the fuck I was in. If I had known, right? Like if I'd been like, oh, back in the 1970s, the leader of this group was systematically raping women, and that they were like pitting up men against each other to physically fight as part of the teaching, I would have been like, I don't think so. you know, like, and I think it comes back to one of those things that I think is true for any former member. Like, you leave the group and you're like, I had no idea what I was participating in, giving money to, giving time to, giving focus, giving energy to, you know? So that's the shocker that keeps popping up. And I think that's a shocker in a good way because it reminds me that people in the world exist who will deceive to that level and betray to that level.
Absolutely. And we see it all around us all of the time in every type of environment, workplace, family environments, and then hidden secret groups that nobody knows about until decades after they've been running, abusing, exploiting, conning individuals. And I think aside from the intrigue and fascination that comes with how is that possible? How is it that nobody knows about these things? There is, of course, all of the methods around coercive control that go into making that possible. And that makes me more interested. So it's like this big cycle of trying to understand, but also finding the whole thing interesting. And you joined in 2006. So at this point, there is access to some type of modern technology. It's not as advanced, anywhere near as advanced in the early 2000s, of course, as it is today. But because of the nature of the group, nobody was going to be writing about any of this stuff until the late sort of 2010s, coming up to 2020 odd. So I don't know how anybody even in the early 2000s would have had a chance of really understanding what this group was and avoiding it. So could you just please give the listeners an overview once more of how you came to begin this misadventure, what your kind of overview a time was like within the group, and then how you eventually decided to leave?
Okay, yes. So the misadventure began with I'm using air quotes here, chance meeting with a woman at Whole Foods who just happened to strike up a friendly conversation with me. Woman was there with her husband and two children, by the way. Um, and by the end of the friendly conversation, said, "It's been so much fun talking with you. We should get together sometime." We exchanged phone numbers over the course of, I don't know how many months it was, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. We quote unquote developed a friendship. um, we at a certain point, she invited me to meet her other friends, and I forgot to mention that, of course, I was in all kinds of emotional crisis at the time, so a prime candidate. And meeting other friends became going to classes, again, air quotes, twice a week. Um, it was quite formal as opposed to like what I pictured when she said, "I'd like to introduce you to other friends," which was like a potluck at somebody's house. um, and then, twice a week kind of expands into, "Oh, and we're doing this project. So can you come in on the weekends?" As with any other cult, it begins this kind of love bombing and excitement and new ideas because this was a school and it simply called itself school. There was no real name. This was the iteration of this group at this point was simply called school. I believe that was because you could Google other names and find, at that point in '06, you could find some information. Um, so I would say like 2 years in, 2.5 years in, when the love bombing is over. In fact, the honeymoon, really, the door slammed one day. And I was not functioning very well. I wasn't functioning very well when I went in. So, as you can imagine, 2 years into like gaslighting and being lied to and manipulated, and, all for the sake of this strange, esoteric, evolutionary school. Um, I was really pretty miserable and not functioning and really falling apart. And at that point, of course, I was ready to go out and make new friends because that was really the whole point, right? Like now you get to go make new friends and to grow the group because it's just like any other cult, right? And then so I was in for a total of 5, but at that point, I was falling apart more and more and more. And at a certain point, I knew it wasn't going to last, because I was miserable and couldn't even like keep a schedule, couldn't keep a job, couldn't think straight. Honestly, I was so riddled with um, cognitive dissonance that my mind was just shredding itself. And at that point, husband steps in. Husband who is not in the group. Let me be clear about that, and says, are you sure this group is not manipulating you? And I said to myself, at the time, I didn't know what to say to him, but to myself, I was like, I have no idea. I don't know my ass from my elbow at this point. Um, so over the course of a weekend, after some drama about my husband, which, they cults don't like pesky spouses who ask questions, right? They don't like that. I decided to leave. But then after I left, it was pretty clear to me, I think relatively quickly, I started stepping back from it and not being influenced by it, and thinking, oh my God, like what the fuck? I mean, I was letting these quote unquote teachers micromanage. I'm an adult and they're telling me, how to manage my relationship with my husband, how to find a job, what jobs I should take, who I can talk to, what I can talk about. And From then, I became just obsessed with the whole phenomenon. So, again, I hope that answers your question.
During my conversation with Spencer, he mentions at certain points he's not totally sold on the idea of school to begin with.
Hmm.
And after a session or two, he has this life-changing event happen that brings him from being down in the dumps to maybe actually I'll be okay. And it was linked to his career.
Hmm.
And you mentioned that you were going through a lot of emotional difficulties. You were at a low point in your life as well. The chapter that shows the interaction that you have with Lisa in Whole Foods, it's painted so perfectly. It's almost like you're there, especially when Lisa uses her child as part of her initiation to converse with you, which I thought was particularly predatory. And Spencer's mind kind of shifted after this happened, and he'd just joined school and thought, oh, actually, maybe it's because I've joined school that these really great things are happening. Did you have a moment like that that affirmed your decision to be in that group?
Um, I can't think of one particular moment at right now. I was aware of my cognitive dissonance from start to finish, and in fact have really kind of parsed out these two. There's the inner starry-eyed believers who are like, this is fabulous, and the inner skeptics were always poking. Um, and even when Lisa talked to me at the Whole Foods, I was initially very skeptical and suspicious because that doesn't happen in Boston. It's not it's not the kind of place where shopkeepers and fellow customers are yakking with each other. However, nothing was really working in my life, and it's so stereotypical, but honestly, I was getting ready to break up with someone. It was lots of drama going on with this breakup right when I met her. And then so I met her, I think it was like May or June, something like that. I go to my first quote unquote class, I think in July or August of the summer. And then in the fall, I started dating my current husband and I found a job. Um, and I felt like everything was turning around. And so I thought, oh, well, there's really something to this. I credited the group, right? Because my luck started to change and I started being able to adult, which honestly, adulting was always confounding to me. And I'm going to point to the book for a second. I kind of equate that to this concept I've come up with called the gentle soul, where, I grow up like a really empathic, creative, spacey kid. And my entire life, everyone's telling me that I'm too sensitive, I think too much, I'm too emotional. And so I didn't have any confidence. Like when you grow up without confidence, you're kind of set up and screwed. Um, so that was my big lesson from, you know, again, stumbling into this group. I'm sorry. Am I getting off topic here with your
No,
question?
not at all. I love this. There's no way to know whether those things in your life would have changed anyway,
Hmm.
whether you would have found yourself kind of stumbling into stability with or without school. And of course, that's the big hypothetical question, isn't it? And Chris Shelton always says you can't live your life in hypotheticals. I imagine that's something that individuals that have left cultic environments do a lot with their own minds. If only I hadn't, or if only I did. Um, so Chris Shelton says you can't live in hypotheticals. And in The Gentle Souls Revolution, your memoir, that cognitive dissonance is present in the book as well. It's present in your writing. As you go through your experiences and you tell the reader about things that are happening, there is always a little part in the writing that's like, well, that's strange, and I'm not sure about that. And oh, do I really want to believe that? And what I what I think I even called back to in our first talk was how incredible your husband was. He was never pushy. He was never forceful. He never was like, you're in a cult. Just kind of little subtle questions and then just, leaving you to kind of think things over. Like, is this what's best for you? Are you getting the best that you could be out of this group? And I just love that. I was just like, yes, that champion all the way through.
I do want to say, we did have a number of fights during the Christmas season, which in the book, you'll see there's a chapter called the Christmas party. So, he did lose his temper every once in a while, but overall, he was incredibly patient with me. And I think I might have left anyway, but I would have been far worse off in the group far longer without this, you know, a solid person in my life. Um, so yeah, I'm sorry if you were heading towards a question.
No, no, I was just recalling parts of the book that have stuck with me.
Mhm.
And your husband's presence throughout your journey was one of those things. And I don't know what relationship would sustain such a dynamic given the nature of school, because you're not supposed to tell anyone about it, you're not supposed to go into details.
Yeah.
After you leave school, you're not supposed to talk to anyone for a certain amount of time on the phone, give anyone a lift home and talk to them in the car. Like there's like this ceremonial
Yes.
silence that takes place,
Yeah.
which of course is information control, stops you
Mhm.
from critically thinking, and all of those things that you detail so well in your book. So what relationship, your husband must have had a very you must have had a very trusting marriage even then for him not to be like, Where is she all the time and who's she spending all her time with?"
Yeah, I mean, my husband is my best friend. There's no reason for us not to trust each other. But the other thing is, honestly, I broke the rules right away and told him I didn't tell him details, but I did say, like, I go to this thing twice a week. And at the time, we're newly dating. And he said, look, if it helps you, it's none of my business. So I think this is actually a really important thing to talk about, that not only do cults fuck with their membership, they leverage trust, they leverage trust between me and my spouse, because my spouse is like, well, I don't want to take this away from you. I want to support you. Um, and in the meantime, the longer you're in the group, the more spouse becomes the enemy. Um, So, something, Casey, if you had a question, I completely forgot because I went off on that tangent, but go ahead.
It's when we talk about cognitive dissonance and then we look at the difference between your husband saying, if it helps you, then I'm glad you have it, and then the group with Robert saying things like, just divorce him, get rid of him, he's no good for you. Like, the difference in those two approaches, that tells you everything about which aspect of your life is toxic and which is supportive
Exactly.
in just those two parallels, which I think is really interesting.
Yep, exactly. That kind of bizarre carnival funhouse, not so fun, distorted mirror, of one person saying, are you sure this is okay for you? You seem like you're not doing so well. I can see you, right? And another person saying, you need to leave your husband because he's trying to control you, right?
Oh my goodness, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that the honeymoon period wore off pretty quickly and then one day the door slammed. Was there a particular memory or notable event that you can call on where you thought, oh, this might not be what I thought it was going to be?
There are so many, Casey, and some of them are in the book. I think, in a way, I had that sense all along, but I think particularly poignant. There, I'm going to jump to when they want me to go out and recruit people, even though there are some other scenarios that really stayed with me, because even when I was what I like to call in my cult coma, I snapped out for a second and thought, wow, that was really fucked up, But the making new friends thing, I think, although I was really, really conflicted about it and did try, I could never swallow that pill because I don't believe in proselytizing. I've always found it offensive. Um, and it followed me around all day. And that's really what made my cognitive dissonance just amp up, screaming sirens. Like, part of me was like, I am being a good doobie. I must speak to this person at the Whole Foods who's, buying tofu or something because maybe they need school because they have this grand idea that they'll never be able to implement without quote unquote the help. I mean, all these groups use the word the help, right? Like, and there's another part of me that was like, you know what? I don't fucking want to talk to this person. Right? I don't have my own life at that point. So I guess, and you know what, that jumps to mind for me, another really specific moment where, so I think in these groups, if you're, I hate to use the terminology of joining a cult because I feel like just nobody fucking joins a cult, right? But um, people who stumble in get duped into, as I did, there's always like some kind of a a defect that you're dealing with, and mine happened to be like around work and money and not being able to hold down a job. And there's a whole drama around them helping me find work that I always lose. I always end up getting fired. um, and so one day I'm driving to a job that I hate, which is writing copy for a software company. And honestly, we used to wonder at the company, me and the designer, the website designer used to wonder, like, are they actually selling software here? What's happening? um, and I hated the job. I hated the environment. And I remember thinking to myself specifically, I'm stuck in traffic on Route 95 commuting to the job. My life is no longer my own. That was a pretty poignant moment. I have traded in who I am for the guidance of this group that has secret, ancient, esoteric knowledge, but somehow I feel like shit, that, you know, should have been a screaming silent siren red flag to leave, but I did not at that point.
The Gentle Souls Revolution does an excellent job of helping the reader understand why certain things can happen and you don't make the decision to leave right away. And that's so important for anyone listening, and myself included, that hasn't had a personal cultic experience, to be able to fathom the idea of why didn't you just leave?
Yeah,
The same as like, how could you join a cult? All of those really kind of naive statements that are thrown about and are quite damaging
mhm,
and are totally misrepresentative of what actually happens.
right.
As you said, it's con artistry. You're being duped. You're being told that what you're being sold is one thing, and it turns out to be something completely different.
Opposite.
What your book does so well is really allow the reader to understand how the level of dependency is ramped up. And I have not come across this in any other book that I've read, and I've been through a lot of memoirs over the last few years. In terms of your first interaction with Lisa up to where you are around the time you decide to leave, you're a completely different person at that point. And there's something in the book that says something along the lines of, I'm not even sure how to wipe my own ass at this point. And of course, in keeping with your humor all the way through as well. But we'd gone through that journey with you, so I felt that was authentic. That's truly how you felt in that moment. You cannot make any decisions for yourself. So I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through how you were able to put that on paper. I don't know that I'd be able to do that with writing.
Well, Casey, I love this question. The truth is, I couldn't not write it. That is simply how I'm wired. And I told you last night I was hanging out with some fellow disgruntled ex students, as we're known, um, and talking about that very thing with this person. That was my recovery. I had to write it. When I mean, it started out as journaling and then it turned into a blog and then the blog turned into the book, right? So the more I could process through writing, also songwriting, any other, I mean, even some drawing, like I'm a, I'm, I'm a creative person. It helps me survive. And that's another thing I kind of realized about me in childhood because, I grew up in the 70s. There wasn't a lot of kind of variation in learning styles, at that point. But I was always doodling and drawing on my notebooks and then getting in trouble, right? And I realized like that was me managing like attention deficit disorder and anxiety, um, so my recovery was writing. My recovery was doing whatever creative thing wanted to express itself so that I could get some distance from this crazy, fucking bizarre, surreal thing and walk away from it and look at it from a distance and then realize, like, oh, these are reasons why I was vulnerable, you know, lack of confidence, looking for guidance, seeking it from outside sources. Here's the way this particular group took advantage of it. You know, oh, here's a lost soul. We have just the thing for you, you know? And this is why it worked. And part of why it worked was because of my own personal struggle. A lot of why this works is because some people know how to take advantage of human nature. For example, most people don't walk around suspicious of everyone they meet, right? Most people extend the benefit of the doubt because most people are not trying to dupe you. So I just feel like some people are wired to go like, here's an opening. And you see the same fucking dynamic play out in I mean, all of these groups, when you strip away the bells and whistles, they operate the same way. So it is really fascinating.
After you left school and decided that you weren't going to go back, did anybody like come after you and attempt to get you back in, or were you kind of threatened not to talk? Because it's a hidden school, so one of the biggest worries of members that do actually say, "Oh my goodness, I can't do this anymore," which of
Mhm.
course by design is not going to be that many people. Uh, what happened? Were you just totally separated, or was there a period of sort of backwards and forwards?
You know, there were some attempts to call me, and at the time, I mean, now, now I think if I got a call from one of the teachers now, I would probably take it so I could laugh. But for me, that was scary at the time. You
Yeah.
know, um, no one blatantly came after me or threatened me. There was in 2014 a very convoluted and stupid attempt to draw me into some legal, you know, wranglings. I got extremely lucky because I happened to talk to a friend of mine who's a lawyer, and he connected me with this enormous firm, and I got pro bono. um, you know, this doesn't happen. I got pro bono counseling from a global firm, and they just like squashed this completely ridiculous. I mean, it would be another 3 hours for me to explain how convoluted and stupid this attempted, you know, subpoena was. So it was kind of in the background, insidious. Um, Sometimes I feel like I still get these weird messages that are, um, you know, I think attempts to like get in there and find out what I'm doing. I had one person who befriended me, so to speak, online, and then was like, "I'd like to read your manuscript," and I was like, "You're not gonna read my manuscript." You know, so it's been kind of, and this is very like the nature of the Boston group, which I like to call the poor cousin, was it was more insidious, more covert, you know, whereas I think New York, which is corporate headquarters, there was more blatant kind of, you know, beat you over the head abusiveness, at least verbally. Um, so, you know, it was so tepid. There was kind of tepid, insidious threats that I have to be honest, in the beginning, I think I was pretty naive. Like I was like, you know, they're not going to come after me. And in a way, I was right. Like Boston likes to fly under the radar. It didn't occur to me that they could and they would, you know. So I think I've been extremely lucky in that way. Um, you know, part of it is that it's the nature of the group. Like if they're so secret, they don't really want to be in public documents like court cases. But New York does not seem to worry about that as much as Boston. So in another way, like I'm lucky if I was gonna do this that it was in Boston because I don't, maybe I'm stupid, but I don't feel that threatened by it.
It's a scary tactic to be served with legal papers, especially if you're not in a position to firstly understand really all of the legal jargon, and terminology, and even the nature of the papers that you've been served, but
Yeah.
also, of course, the financial position. Sharon Gans was, well, I suppose Alex before he was like, kicked out by his own spouse. Um,
Yeah.
Sharon had Sharon Gans had a very particular type of person that she favored in the group. So school had a lot of lawyers, Spencer Schneider, a lawyer,
Hmm.
and various different people from middle to higher class occupations who would be able to connect or advise or pay for
Yeah.
very strong legal representation for school. So, of course, when they come to you with legal papers, that fair gaming tactic is very scary.
Hmm.
And although you can't call their bluff and say, okay, then let's go to court, where they'd probably go, oh, no, actually, we don't want to. But then they just send representatives and people that aren't directly linked to school. So it's tough. And I think that that tactic works most of the time. I think 90% of the time,
Yeah.
people are going to think, I can't do anything about this, so I'll never be able to tell my story.
Yeah, which is terrible because there's so many ways in which that re-traumatizes someone who's already traumatized. I mean, even my experience, which was really relatively tame compared to other people I've spoken to who have been threatened legally, you know, had me terrified. I was like, financial ruin, this is my fault, I shouldn't have spoken out. These people really do have the power that I was afraid they had. You go right back into that cult mindset. The court system becomes weaponized. It's terrible. I really, this is obviously a topic I feel so passionately about, and I hope at some point there are some remedies for this misuse of the justice system, and you turn it into bullying and badgering and abusing people who have already been bullied and badgered and abused. It's terrible.
In your writing, there is a lot of references to various different educational pieces around cults and coercive control, which I thought was, again, quite different from a lot of the various memoirs I've read, and really helpful. It's like a reading list for
Yeah.
books to go and educate yourself inside a memoir about somebody's personal experiences in a cult. What was your cult education like after you left and after you began your healing journey of writing and then maybe thought, I'm going to put this into a book? What does that look like?
When I started stepping back from this group, and I mean, this because we've talked about this, but like there was literally, I took a road trip with my husband the week after I left the group, and the farther away we got from Massachusetts, we were going to South Carolina, the more I saw, and the more I started, these puzzle pieces started emerging, and the more manipulation and coercion I saw. So, um, by the time I got back, I think, it's a weird thing to look back on because on the one hand, I was putting things together. On the other hand, there was still a little bit of starry eyed believer in me that was keeping the secret, right? And, but, we got home and I was like, I feel crazy because I'm walking around like I'm normal and I have these scenes, like movie scenes, running through my mind and I can't talk about it with anyone, right? So first I went to the internet and I found these, evil websites by the disgruntled ex-students. The one that was really, really integral to my recovery was Esoteric Freedom, which was taken down by cult litigation. But everyone was going to this website and blog and writing about their stories. And I was like, holy shit, there are all these people writing about this. So I obsessively read, the posts over and over again and everyone's comments and the responses to comments. That, sent me to Steve Hassan's Freedom of Mind. Then Robert J. Lifton, I just read it. I mean, my book is falling apart. I can't even find it right now. But Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. I think that it's shredded now. I read it so many times. Margaret Singer's Cults and Our Myths. I just started devouring as much material as I could. And the reason it was so fascinating to me is because I kept going, oh my God, school checks every fucking box. Everyone. Mystical manipulation. Yup. The confession. Yup. All of it. Just I couldn't believe how, and then in 2014 I also went to my first International Cultic Studies Association conference where I met former members from other groups, and I was like, we are all telling the same story here. All of these groups operate under these guidelines, you know. So it's so fascinating to me that there's a template for coerciveness and abusiveness. Um, and I still still devouring as much as I can. I mean, lately it's been Dr. Ramani. Are you familiar with Dr. Ramani?
No, I don't think so.
She's a YouTube, well, she's a psychologist who's an expert on narcissism, but she has a YouTube channel that's got like millions and millions of people who are like, "Thank you so much for writing. Now I understand what was going on." You're like, "There's a problem here," you know. So
Makes me hope that this kind of work will allow people to bring some of the education into schools so that children can learn to recognize what this looks like, whether it's in a family home, whether it's in school itself, whether
mhm.
it's in your first job. I was treated horrifically in my first job, and I just thought, well, everyone's told me my whole life, don't grow up too quickly because work's horrible, and here I am, and they were right. Like, no, I think back now and I think, oh my goodness, that is not legal, I don't think.
Yeah,
So that is hopeful. The spotlight on cults and coercive control in the media, in documentaries, in newspapers, even in the legal systems right now. There's talk of bringing in certain measures around coercion.
hmm,
It's so important, and it couldn't happen sooner. And this, your story of picking up these books and understanding what happened to you is testament to those things. Did you always know, once you'd decided you were gonna write a complete book, did you always know that you would include
yeah,
parts of the cult education that you'd
yes.
learned at that point?
Yeah, I love that you asked this because most of the book is formatted so that I tell a vignette, and then there's a section on the analysis and the research and, interviews with other cult members. And then there's a section on here's a template for recovery. Take this, customize it for yourself. I hope it helps you, kind of a thing. Because I'm a therapist, so of course that's going to be my focus. But I think that including the research and the interviews with other members was really important to me because I wanted to really drive home, like, not only are all these groups alike, and if you talk to former members, you're going to get a different, a variation on the same themes, but there's research that points all of this out. Lifton, I think, was doing his interviews with prisoners or ex-prisoners from re-education camps in communist China in, like, I don't know, the early 70s. Now, his book is not easy to read, but the information's out there, and it's been out there for several decades. And I think what you're saying about education is so important because, listen, we don't learn how to spot con artists. They know how to spot us,
Yeah.
but we don't learn, like, if somebody does this, what's this thing, that I like to call consistently inconsistent, like, I'm gonna be there at 2, and you're waiting for your new boyfriend or girlfriend at 2, and you're like, it's 2:45, and then you get a phone call, I'm on my way. You gotta kind of start going, something isn't right here. That's just one example of consistently inconsistent. But you get the idea.
How long did your publication take to finish? How long were you working on it all together, do you think?
Oh, well, I started really writing it in 2016, and I was taking content from the blog, so that, part of it was kind of written, but and I just published in February, so how many years does that? Do the math, too long. um, but I think, in part that was because I was really determined to include research. I didn't want it to be simply a story about my experience. I have nothing wrong with memoirs. I think they're really important. Um, Spencer's memoir is really beautiful, and a very poignant example of how this shit works. And we're talking about like a really savvy New York lawyer. Um, and, you know, I think that most of the memoirs I've read are really poignant, but I wanted there to be this, like, yes, I've had this experience, and here are the things you need to look out for.
Hmm.
Here are the red
Yeah.
flags that I wish I had known about. And here's the way you recover. I really wanted all those things in there.
Were you aware of Spencer and his story when you decided this was going to become a completed book? Did things keep happening where you were like, well, now I have to include this part and this part?
um, I, Spencer and I have been aware of each other, probably, I'm gonna guess he put up a blog at some point, and I can't remember exactly when that was, maybe 2014, something like that. And we didn't have a lot of back and forth initially, but then of course, we're both on the same mission, so we started going back and forth over emails and then talking on the phone, and we just met for the first time like a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, yeah, which was so
Oh,
much fun. Yeah, so so I don't know. I don't know how much we've influenced each other in terms of writing and what to include and what not to, but I'm sure that we have. I'm just not exactly sure where that where those things start to cross over. But it was very interesting for me to learn about New York, um, and learn how it was the same and how it was different. And because as you know, and I write about in the book, my experiences with Sharon Gans were like, oh my God, who is this crazy lady? Like, why? Who is she? Because she would show up, every once in a while and teach a class, and everyone would be kissing her ass, and I didn't know who she was. Like, no one introduced her, So to learn how over the top she was, how mean she was, how abusive she was. It wasn't that way in Boston. It was way more insidious and underhanded.
for anybody listening that is thinking about writing their story or putting their journaling into a book or releasing their poetry or any of those things that a writer might contemplate in today's world of publication,
Mhm.
how did you make the decision to publish your book and what steps did you have to take to accomplish that?
Um, well, I had some encouragement. Sorry, I'm dealing with a cough drop right now, but so people who had read the blog had at times said to me, "You should turn this into a book," and I was like, "Yeah, that'd be great," but I have no idea what that process is. I don't know publishing it. I felt so clueless about it. But then I have a friend named Deirdre whose family is in publishing. They're in poetry and children's books, I believe. So it wasn't, she couldn't sign me or anything like that. But I had lunch with her one day. I mean, she specifically sat me down and said, "You really have a book here." Um, so I said, "All right, I'm gonna give this a shot," you know. Yeah. So that was helpful, and I have to say also that for me, writing has always been, I don't know, a thing that comes really naturally. Even as a kid, I was journaling, I was writing short stories, you know. So um, at that point, it's a little foggy, honestly, but I can remember like over time coming up with this concept of not only do I want to write my story, I want to talk about the research. I want to talk about other people's experiences compared to mine. And, you know, I do think in the memoir world, what does lack is information about recovery and how you can reclaim your life, you know? And here are some tools, you know. I don't see a whole lot of that. So I felt like that was a really important part of my book, you know, like guess what? You know, not only can you feel better, you can thrive, which, you know, is becoming quite an overused word, but it's the only one that I can think of that's accurate enough. You can thrive if you learn how this happened, why it happened, and how you can take this learning forward, you know? Um, so the formatting started to kind of emerge from inside. And then I have to give credit to my friend Jamie Swally, who I met at, she's on the book cover because I met her at a conference in Santa Fe, an International Cultic Studies conference. And this was in 2019. So 2020, um, COVID hits, we're all in lockdown. Um, she lives in Nevada. I live in Massachusetts. She used to Zoom with me in the morning, which is quite early on her end, because I would get kind of lost, you know, in the formatting and trying to organize the content. It was really, really difficult. And Jamie, for absolutely no money, in fact, I actually insisted on paying her later because she was like a default editor, you know, and she spent hours with me on Zoom at like she was like 3 in the morning in Nevada, and she's on Zoom
Oh,
with me,
wow.
um, helping me organize the content. So she was just integral to the process. And then I've had a lot of support from Debbie Shriver, who is right now the president of ICSA. And she talked to me a lot about how to go about publishing. And, you know, finally it was like, I could look for a publisher or I could just self publish on Amazon. Because, you know, frankly, I've had people telling me how to say this and what to do for too long. And I don't really need that kind of guidance and I don't want to seek it out. And, you know, I want to have the agency and independence that I got from self publishing. So, and, you know, I had a few like not so wonderful experiences with these self publishing companies that charge money. That we won't fall down that rabbit hole because it could be like a whole other show. But, you know, it's like a lot of people want to publish a book and it's, you know, speaking of con jobs, it's a good way to get people to pay you money, you know, to promise them that you'll help them write and publish their book and then market it for them and then not, you know. So in terms of people wanting to write their own story, the nice thing is that it's so possible now to publish. And it's, I think, an incredibly healing thing to do. I encourage people to do it. We actually need as many stories as possible to demonstrate don't do this.
Yeah. Yeah, the variety, but the same as well.
Yeah, yeah,
That books offer, again, that template almost.
yeah.
But each person's story comes with a variation on that template, whether it's the name of the group that you're a part of, or whether it's like, oh, this is our mantra instead of, this is our chant, or all of those things. It's so important because then we can recognize it universally. Oh my goodness, I've heard someone use that word before in another group, not
Mm,
this one. What's happening here? So I completely agree. And the more the more stories that we can get out there about different groups, the more we're putting out into the universe itself. So that if anybody's like, oh, I'm thinking about joining Darn Yoga, Google's Darn Yoga, someone's written their memoir about how you should never join Darn Yoga, and then somebody's like, I'm not going to join Darn Yoga, and wouldn't that just be the most incredible thing?
mhm.
Imagine
Yeah,
getting approached in Whole Foods and you're like, oh gosh, something's not right about this. So I won't take your number, but thanks for the lovely chat.
yeah. Yep, enjoyed meeting you and your family, but maybe we don't need to become friends, you know?
Yeah. And here we are, we're back in hypotheticals again, but that was me. So I do apologize for that. Just
But that I think is a really natural place to go, Do my friend I may have told you this in the last whenever we spoke last, but my friend Doug asked me once, like, would you go back and change it? And I write about this in the book, would you go back and change your experience? And I was like, you know, maybe, but in a way, it pushed me into a corner and I had to come out swinging, and I learned a lot from that. 5 years is way too long, though. If I could change it, maybe let's reduce it. Let's shrink it down to like 5 months.
it's strange to think about what 5 months would have looked like. Again, I'm just kind of thinking about the hypothetical
Mhm.
because 5 months wouldn't have been long enough for you to be deployable. I
Right,
say in air quotes.
right.
5 months is it's you're not funneled in enough at that point to be trusted to go out and air quotes make new friends.
Yeah, that's a really
Um
good point because that really was the thing that pushed me over the edge. It's like, I don't want to do this. I don't even believe in it. I am violating my own principles by going out and making new quote unquote friends. You know, I hated it. So I
oh,
sucked
I
at it.
yeah, I don't I feel like they call it secondhand cringe or secondhand embarrassment when somebody knocks on your door to sell you something, and I just think, oh gosh, I would feel so uncomfortable if that was me.
Yeah.
Even if it's people knocking on the door to ask who my current energy supplier is, if they can get me I know it's still selling you something, but it's not like, it's not
Yeah, at least there's some use and value for you in it. But can I tell you, after I left
oh,
one day, Jehovah's Witnesses came to the door, and Casey, I was like, let me make you some tea. You know, I was like, I used to do stuff like this. um, and then they tried to give me their pamphlets, and I was like, I'm not gonna read these. Wouldn't you rather be doing something else right now? Like, I
and I'm
mean,
sure that most of them were, deep down the answer is yes.
they haven't been back, so
Since you have left the Odyssey study group school, what the other names that were used, down in
Mhm,
California ways,
mhm.
have you heard any news, any whispers of the goings and comings of OSG, or have you just kind of left it there? You're not really in touch with people still involved,
Yeah.
so you don't really know.
I don't really know. I have heard whisperings. For example, I have heard whisperings that Robert, who was, head honcho in Boston, got kicked out, and I do think that's true. Um, Obviously, well, or not, Sharon Gans died. Um, I'm pretty sure that New York classes are continuing. Well, I know that for sure that they are with a new, a new set of leaders. These leaders have been included in Sharon's will, which is very interesting. Um,
She's
um,
given back some of the money that was given to her.
yes, with the expressed desire that business should continue. So there's their burden in life, I guess. I don't have no idea what's going on in Boston over the years, and I would say maybe as recently as I don't know, maybe last year, people will contact me through the blog and say, that they'd been approached. So I think they're still out there trying to continue this, but it's a little hard to think that it's very successful. Truth is, I don't really know. You know.
That's incredible. Isn't that that is so incredible that people are being approached. It's the same thing I just said about Darn Yoga. People are being approached and they're able to go and research and they're finding your blog and your warnings and your
Mhm.
preventative measures are working. That is incredible, Esther.
That makes me happy.
Oh gosh.
Yeah,
Thwarting the efforts, and I'm sure that it's angering and frustrating for them as well. So that's just kind of like a nice little cherry on top of all the other work that's going into this.
for sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's funny because my blog is, it's not getting tons of traffic, but I just kind of leave it up there as a resource. And every once in a while, I get an email from someone who was like, thanks for putting this blog up because, these people approached me at, I don't know, Pete's Coffee, and then they courted me for months and months and months. It's the same process. That's the thing. They haven't changed the make new friends recruitment process that much.
That makes sense regarding the size of the group the size that we predict it to be, because of course there's no way of really knowing. But going by the group sizes that you were a part of, that Spencer was a part of, with organizations like the Jehovah's Witnesses, we know there are hundreds of thousands. So if you were to have a blog where you were writing about your experiences in the Jehovah's Witnesses and why you shouldn't join and why some might consider it a cult, even though interestingly on jw.org there's a section titled Why We Are Not a Cult. Um
That's funny.
you
Anyway,
you would probably get more traffic on that website because the proselytizing operation is much bigger and it's global. So with something like school,
mhm.
if there are not as many people to proselytize or propagate with Jeff's work or whoever it is that's been, blacked out, as you talk about in your book, if the operation is smaller, then less people will be approached and less people will be looking on
Yeah.
the internet for, who the heck just spoke to me then. So that makes a lot of sense. I think that's probably perfect. It's probably just right. In terms of your work around cult education, aside from your memoir, I did see your name on the International Cultic Studies Association conference for this year. So you plan to bring a panel to the conference yourself this year?
It is a panel with the hashtag I got out um, campaign, online campaign, right? So I am a collaborator. That's the word I wanted. I am a collaborator. I'm one of many people who, all former members, as far as I know. There may be a few that are involved that aren't directly former members, but the whole point of this hashtag I got out is tell your story so that other people know, so that you can recover, to provide education about this because we really need to be telling people this can happen. It can happen to you if you're just having a bad day. So that's going to be a panel discussion there.
And that will have already taken place by the time this episode is released.
Mhm.
And it's quite typical for ICSA to have ways of people watching panels back online after they've taken place. So if there is any information available on those panels, I'll put that in the episode description.
Yeah.
Are you involved in any legal action that is happening against school? Because I've read in some newspaper articles that there is legal action, although the people involved in that legal action can't comment on it because it's ongoing.
Yes, I am not, and I don't really plan to. I don't really want to get involved in any legal action. And I think it's a little harder with Boston to do that. My experience is too much like too much can be too much of like, well, you made a choice to do this, and nothing terrible happened because it's insidious, so you can't really point to anything specific. you know I unfortunately, like, it's hard to sue or charge someone with ongoing coercive control. It's not illegal to systematically lie to get somebody to join your esoteric school. I suppose, though, it could be fraud, right? I haven't thought about it, but you know I it doesn't really kind of fit what I want to do. I'm really happy with my work right now, which is kind of half my clients are former members and half aren't, but I love that work, and I don't really want to put my focus anywhere else. I know a little bit about the legal stuff. It's all coming out of New York as far as I know. And again, I think maybe because it's a little more blatant there. Um, Um, when when I was served legal papers, it came from New York, from a woman I'd never met before who, made claims about what I knew. Somehow she magically knew that I was withholding information from her, although I'd never met her in my life, some bullshit like that. So I think most of the legal stuff is in New York. And I'm really not interested. I'm not interested in suing school. I am interested in pursuing remedies. I'm not a lawyer, but I would love to see law schools studying this phenomenon and trying to address it. You know, like, let's have legal labs at Harvard Law School and NYU and throughout the country. We should have labs studying this misuse and abuse of our court system, to silence people in the land of free speech, right? So,
Well, hopefully this lawsuit will go in the direction of the underdogs instead of
yeah.
those exploiting the system. I really hope so. I really do hope so. I know that people suing for damages have been damaged and should be what's the word you use for that in the legal term? Compensated.
Yeah. Yeah.
Compensated for those damages.
I'm sorry, one of those suits really sounds a lot like the format of it sounds a lot like what I forget her name, Moira something, the woman who the prosecutor, the Nixium case, you know,
Penza?
Penza, something like that. That because it focuses on
Human
uh,
trafficking.
trafficking. Yeah.
Yeah, I spoke to an international lawyer, Carol Murchison, the other day, and she said that because coercion is not illegal, as you just said, it's not illegal to perpetually lie to somebody until they agree to join your, secret group.
Right.
Human trafficking is illegal and it is a staple part of some of the most insidious but successful coercive groups. So that's what a lot of lawyers are going after now. So I can see that. And even reading Spencer's memoir,
Mhm.
Manhattan Cult Story, there are clear-cut examples of labor exploitation and labor trafficking in his book. And that's without all of the things that happened around children being placed with different families, outside of the appropriate legal channels that adoption should take place in.
Yeah.
So, anybody interested in learning more about Spencer's story, you can find Spencer Schneider's book, Manhattan Cult Story, all over wherever you get your books. And Esther Friedman's book, The Gentle Soul's Revolution, is actually now live on the Amazon store. You can purchase it as of February 2023, self-published, incredible book. Really goes into how an individual can be approached in a grocery store one year and 5 years later be wholly dependent on the group itself, and it's an education. It's wonderful. I really recommend people go pick up a copy. Has your husband read the book, Esther?
It's very funny. He's stuck on chapter 6, and I'll tell you why. Chapter 6 is the Christmas parties, and
Yes.
that was the worst part of it. My experience and his experience was Christmas season. That is when the group really intentionally comes between couples and family members and marriages. And so he's read everything up to that, and he's like, you should be really proud of this. This is really great, and I can't read this. So he's stuck right now. And it's too bad because he does get a lot of praise in the book for for his approach and support and things like that. I hopefully he can get through that part of it. But that to me is one is interesting because I know it's not that he's not reading it. He wants to read it, but it speaks to the damage, the ripple effect of damage perpetuated by school and the Jehovah's Witnesses and Scientology and Nixium and all of them. They all damage and shred our society. It's
Yeah.
terrible.
You're at a particularly difficult, vulnerable part of your experience within school at that point during the Christmas chapter as well. The demand for more of your time, the basically the sleep deprivation, and I don't know where I am or what's going on or what I'm supposed to be doing or where I'm supposed to be going, and all of that stuff is kind of reaching a sort of a climax at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine it's hard for your husband to remember how you were during those times in yourself, and how it must have felt for him observing your behavior and the difficulties that you were going through and not being able to really kind of like pull everything apart because you the cognitive dissonance is kind of just
Yeah.
banging heads at this point. So it must be tough for him not only to recall how he felt during those times but how he saw you struggling as well.
Yeah. I mean, as you can imagine, holiday seasons were incredibly lonely for him. And we were fighting. Imagine that. We were fighting a lot because I was like, oh, but I have to go do this thing, this thing that you're not supposed to know about, right? And he did at one point, actually, truth be told, at, at one point say, this is a cult that you're in. So he wasn't completely able to, I mean, it's really hard to kind of keep it under, under the wire for that long. But yeah, I think, look, he was watching me for 5 years fall apart, become an empty shell, not the woman that he became engaged to, in 2007. Um,
So tough. That must have been so tough for both of you.
yeah, and I was really certifiable, Casey. I mean, I laugh about it. It's probably not funny, but if I had gone to an ER, I think they would have been like, we need to put you on a psych unit because I really wasn't functioning. I couldn't. It's really so hard to describe that I couldn't think. I couldn't put a sentence together, and I was like, somehow, I don't know how I was functioning in the world. I somehow, like, like an automaton managed to kind of do my job. I mean, I got fired from all my jobs, so I wasn't doing that well, but Um, you
This is
know,
another thread that is so well woven throughout your writing as well. Just shows that descent into a place where you aren't able to function anymore as a result of the tactics used by the group. And it really is just such a wonderful read. I had the opportunity to read a variation, I imagine at this point, of the book a few months back. So I haven't got round to reading the newest version, but am lucky enough to have a copy. So I do look forward to reading it. And I just recommend everybody go and grab a copy. I'll put the links to the book in the episode description. And I just wanted to ask you, Esther, when you mentioned that you were working with former members as part of your therapy work, is this former members of school or former members of various different cults?
various cults. I don't know that I would work with former members of school because it's too close. I would probably refer them to someone else. But I have a lot of actually witnesses that, and most of them are like second generation, as in their parents were in it. You know, um, yeah, most of my clients come from other cults in terms of that, like half the client load that is, former members.
Do you think you would ever position yourself as uh, solely working with cult survivors and being sort of trauma informed specifically for those that have had these experiences? Because I don't know that there are many therapists out there that specialize in that specifically.
Yeah, I think, the interesting thing is that it's becoming more of my clientele are former members than less, which, I didn't really expect. But I think, since we're living in the age of like really blatant gaslighting and people are really starting to understand what narcissism is, that I would, if that was my full practice, I wouldn't complain. I'll put it that way. I just didn't think in the beginning that I'd be able to have a full practice with former members, but yeah, actually I could, because the demand is pretty great right now, and it's really unfortunate that we don't have more therapists who are specializing in that. Although that number is also growing, so
Feel like there is a reckoning happening slowly. I don't know if it's just the echo chamber that I'm in, but things feel like they're slowly shifting in a very empowering
yeah,
direction, and I hope that that continues. And I think our conversation today will be really helpful for individuals who are looking to empower themselves through publishing their own stories, which can be done now, which I think is wonderful. If anybody would like more information on how that's possible, I'm sure that if you email me, I can send information along to Esther. And I know that Esther, you've worked with Jarette a lot on the Writing to Reckon workshops as well. So there are writing workshops for cult survivors who would like help in putting together their story.
yeah, yeah. So Jarette, you know what? I don't. I suppose you can find her website, but she also a former member, someone who's become a friend. But she's put together a writing program, recovery through writing program. And I believe that she does a lot on Zoom, so you don't have to. She's in Vermont, but you don't have to live there. So and actually, Jarrett and I are going to do a little book tour this summer on the way after the ICSA conference. We're driving back
Oh,
to the New
that's
England area.
awesome.
So,
Oh, that's amazing. Oh, Durette. This is Durette Bouillon for anybody who would like more information. I've done an episode with Durette as well, who is co-founder of hashtag I Got Out. And so all of Esther's work has kind of come in full circle with some of the key players in the cult education field, which is awesome. And again, Duret's just one of the warmest, kindest, most loveliest people I've ever met. So I imagine that your personality and hers together is like quite a fun dynamic. Oh yeah, that sounds great.
We've had a
I
lot of great.
mean, I want to go out for a beer with Spencer. I told him one day I'm going to buy him a Heineken and we're going to sit down and have a pint. So hopefully that's the case because I imagine Spencer's a lot of fun as well in person.
Yes, we had fun meeting him. We had lunch with him, and actually, at one point I remember Spencer and I were like, "Let's go to Liverpool, meet Casey." So,
Oh
which was
gosh.
so much fun. I need to get a passport, but
That'd be like a dream come true for me. I would love that. I'll take you on the best tour of the city. I will be your personal tour guide and I will take you to all of the best spots and landmarks and buy you both some beer and it will be great. I would love that.
do it.
So I've spoken to Esther at length before. We did a two-part episode a while back. That's episode 161. So if anybody would like to hear an interview with Esther, where I ask her about her experiences in depth and detail, and we really go through the Gentle Souls Revolution and and pick the memoir apart and discuss all of those things, you can do that in 161. And then I did have the opportunity to speak with Esther and Spencer together, where they compared and contrasted their writing and their experiences of the New York branch and the Boston branch of the Odyssey study group, which is a really interesting conversation, and treated us to some readings from both of their books as well. So that's episode 182. I'll put the links in the episode description. And if anybody would like to get the most detail on school and on Esther's experiences, you can go and pick up a copy of The Gentle Souls Revolution just to catch up today with Esther and an opportunity to promote her writing and her work. And it's really important that we share that around and get that out there. So, unless you've got anything else to add for us today, Esther, I've got to the end of my questions.
Gosh, no, I think I'm good. I do look forward one day to meeting you in person. That'll be fun. Let's make that happen, okay?
I really hope so. I hope that I can make it to an ICSA conference one year. I know that they have held it in the UK
Yeah.
from time to time, but this year's lineup, I looked at the schedule and I was like, I've spoken to almost every single person, and I'm so excited. And if only I could be there to be like, oh my goodness, look at all these people that I've had the opportunity to speak with. So I look forward to the panels that take place during that weekend and the opportunity to meet as many of the people I've spoken with as possible, yourself and Spencer included.
Well, it's always wonderful to speak with you and be on your podcast. And thank you for doing this podcast because it's important I think, I don't know what your listenership is like now, but I imagine it's pretty vast. And you do,
It grows from week to week.
yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you
Okay.
so much, Esther, for your time, for your writing, for coming and spending more time with me today, answering our questions, and self publishing your work as well. I imagine that is a very daunting thing. There's validation from friends who had a cheeky little look at the manuscript and the book whilst it was coming together, but it's scary putting yourself out there in the world. A spoken interview is one thing, a written memoir of your own experiences is something else entirely, and not by a ghostwriter as well, like many of the big names in the world may get theirs out there. So I think that that is truly inspirational, and hopefully our conversation today may encourage some other people to put their stories
So,
in the written form, spoken form, caricature,
yeah,
comic strips,
creative.
whatever it looks like. Hopefully, our conversation can encourage some of those people today. Thank you so much, Queen Esther, for your time. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Casey. I hope you do too.
Thank you, Esther. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you.